Today in Aetherdrift, we get a tutoring horse, a self-discard payoff, a sweet constructed playable vehicle, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Aetherdrift spoilers. So tomorrow is the official end of spoiler season. We should have the full set out tomorrow or early Friday morning, but today we still have some pretty sweet stuff to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Magic cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Aetherdrift. First up today, we get a new white mythic vehicle in Salvation Engine, and I honestly am not sure what to make of this card. So it's a 4-mana 6/10 vehicle. Says other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever this vehicle attacks, return up to one target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then crew of 6. So it is a very high crew number, although keep in mind, it pumps your other artifact creatures, and it cares about artifacts, right? Because it reanimates artifacts when it attacks. So in an artifact deck, crew 6 isn't actually as bad as it looks. Like 2 1/1s. Technically, you're going to have 6 power if they're artifact creatures because of its Anthem ability. So Salvation Engine, if you think about this card, it's essentially Tempered Steel for 2 more mana, but you get the upside of it being on a vehicle. And if you attack with it, you get to refurbish, which is kind of ridiculous. This card, if you can actually crew it and start attacking with it in the right deck, it can take over the game incredibly quickly because you can get back any artifact. There's no restriction on that, and you're hitting with a 6/10, and your artifacts are getting +2/+2 because of Salvation Engine. So how do we play this card? First, you could just play it kind of like Tempered Steel in some sort of artifact aggro deck where you're playing Ginger Brutes and Swooping Lookouts and Goldforge Thopteryxes and Surgingers, just cheap artifact creatures. Then you drop Salvation Engine, and all of a sudden, your Ginger Brutes at 3/3, your Thopteryx is hitting for 3 in the air, your Surgingers of 5/3, and just make your team big and try to win that way. I'm not sure if it'll be good enough played this way just because it's 5 mana. Tempered Steel was 3 mana and was really, really good. At 5 mana, I don't know if Tempered Steel is that interesting. So I feel like you're going to need a deck that can take advantage of the Anthem effect, but can also take advantage of reanimating stuff from your graveyard. Also worth mentioning, we still got Might tokens in Standard. They happen to be artifacts. I can imagine a world where you like cast a White Sun's Twilight to blow up all your opponent's stuff, and then the next turn just drop this, pump all your Mights to 3/3s, kill your opponent in one attack. So that could be another possibility. The other possibility is focusing in on the reanimation mode of this card. So that's where it gets a little tricky. If you focus on the reanimation mode, you might not have artifact creatures. And if you're trying to crew this with non-artifact creatures that aren't getting buffed by its Anthem, crew 6 is probably a deal breaker. Like, that is just way too much power to have to dump into this to get an attack, especially since, in theory, your opponent can let you tap your team to crew it and then just kill it at instant speed with Artifact 8 or something. But if you can attack with this, imagine getting back a Portal to Phyrexia, Valor's Flagship, these huge, massive game-ending artifacts. That's what Salvation Engine offers. So it's going to be a very interesting card to see just how it shakes out, because I feel like you want a deck that can take advantage of its Anthem. So you need artifact creatures, preferably cheap ones, but then you also are kind of incentivized to have these big artifacts that you want to reanimate from your graveyard. Figuring out how to mesh that all together into a functional deck, that I think is the challenge of Salvation Engine. That said, there is one cheat code for this card in Standard, which is cards that turn it into a creature without actually having to crew it. So this is another vehicle that is insane with Chandra Sparkhunter or Culloden Triumph Caster. These cards that can just turn vehicles into artifact creatures. They even both give the creature haste. So if you have a Chandra out and then the next turn Salvation Engine, you're just like, go to combat, turn it into a 6/10, smash your opponent, reanimate your big thing. Really, really powerful line. So I'm curious if we can see some sort of like non-crewing vehicle deck develop around these two cards. Maybe it's not consistent enough because if you don't have the Chandra, what's Salvation Engine doing? But I think it could be an interesting way to play it. Once you get into older formats, maybe this could show up in the Mr. Plow deck. You get more ways to animate a vehicle without crewing it. Mech Hanger, Peace Walker Colossus. We played this Pioneer Colosso Plow deck that was basically built around that, cheating on crew cost to be able to turn these really high crew cost vehicles into creatures early in the game. The only thing about Salvation Engine is it's kind of expensive for that deck. That deck wanted to be kind of like Hammer Time and win really quickly. I'm not sure we can get away with playing a 5-drop in that deck, but it would be really powerful if it is good enough. Speaking of Pioneer, also worth pointing out that it seems like Wizards kind of specifically tried to exclude this from Greasefang decks by making the crew cost 6. I think it just kills it in Greasefang, which is probably a good thing, because if you could get this in your graveyard with Greasefang, you could like reanimate it and then reanimate a Parhelion or something permanently. But I think Wizards kind of sneakily made sure this wasn't going to show up in the Greasefang deck, although Greasefang already got Valor out of this set, which is probably enough support. As far as Commander is concerned, you could play this in kind of any artifact deck, especially an artifact deck that's about artifact creatures and kind of going wide with them, like Brea or Urtad. Decks like that, we're going to make a bunch of small artifacts. This seems pretty good as an anthem for your team, a double anthem for your team that eventually might reanimate something. It's also obviously great in vehicle decks or other commanders that can cheat on the crew cost. So like Katori gives all your vehicles crew 2. When you can crew this for 2 instead of 6, the card becomes kind of busted. Same with Sidri Galvanic Genius. You can just turn an artifact that's not a creature into a creature until end of turn for 1 blue mana. So I think it could show up there as well. So Salvation Engine, the card looks really, really strong. It's got some weird numbers on it with like the crew 6, figuring out how that works, what deck it's going to fit in. That's going to be the challenge of the card, but I feel like this card has potential to be very, very good, very playable if someone can thread the needle and find the right build that can somehow harness its double anthem mode with the big artifact reanimation mode. If you can jam all that together in the right deck, it could end up being really, really good. We also got a new white vehicle that seems built for constructed in Skyseer's Chariot. So a 2-mana 3/3 flying vehicle with crew 2 that says, as it enters, choose a non-land card name and then activated abilities of sources with the chosen name costs 2 more to activate. So Skyseer's Chariot, it's kind of like Anointed Peacekeeper, a little bit of a twist, because Anointed Peacekeeper would also tech spells in your opponent's hand, make them more expensive to cast. Skyseer's Chariot doesn't really do that. It just taxes things on the battlefield, like a weird pseudo Pithing Needle. But I still think this card is pretty powerful. Anointed Peacekeeper was good back in the day. Pithing Needle sees play as a hate card in various formats, and as we've talked about before, if your vehicle isn't going to have some busted ETB trigger or something, and this does have a helpful ETB trigger, but unless you're a Reckoner Bankbuster or a Zika's Chariot, if you're going to be a playable vehicle, you really want a low crew cost and flying. Those are the 2 big abilities of stuff like Heart of Huron, Smuggler's Copter, Aethersphere Harvester, and I think that Skyseer's Chariot kind of hits that mark. A 2-mana 3/3 flyer, pretty reasonable rate. That's Smuggler's Copter stats. And then crew 2, a little bit higher than crew 1, but still pretty reasonable for crewing. So I think this card should have a chance to see play in Standard, maybe even in other formats. So what do you do with this card? Essentially attacks your opponent's abilities. So, for example, this slows down Radiant Lotus, one of the scariest cards from the set. Sure, you can still activate it, but you gotta spend 2 more mana, which might buy you an extra turn before your opponent pops off. It shuts down Planeswalkers. Sure, you can still activate your Kaido, but if every time you +1 or 0, you gotta pay 2 mana, that's actually going to make Kaido a lot worse. It shuts down other vehicles. You can't crew them up. It shuts down creature lands. So I feel like this taxing effect is relevant in a lot of matchups. And once you get outside of Standard, then there's even more things it hits on. Think about Urza's Saga, the One Ring, Yawgmoth, and notably, this doesn't even exclude mana abilities. Normally, these effects exclude mana abilities, so you can still tap your Birds of Paradise or whatever. Obviously, Skyseer's Chariot, you can't target a land, so that would just be too busted if you could name like Island or something. But still, a Birds of Paradise or a Delighted Halfling, effects like that, this also pretty much just straight up shuts them down, because you're not going to pay 2 mana to make 1 mana with your Birds of Paradise. So Skyseer's Chariot, not a flashy card, but I feel like this, because of its mana cost, because of its abilities, is kind of designed just to be a good card for formats like Standard, and could maybe even slip into older formats like Pioneer or even Modern. We also got a pretty interesting new horse in Guardian Sunmare. So Guardian Sunmare, 5 mana for a 5/5 horse mount. It has Ward 2, which I think is going to be really important if this card's going to work in Standard. And then it says, whenever this creature attacks while saddled, search your library for a non-land permanent, mana value 3 or less, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle, and then saddle for 4. So this card is really tricky to break down. The good news is, if you actually get to play this, and it sticks, and you get to saddle it and attack with it, the value is ridiculous. Tutoring any non-land mana value 3 or less directly into play, that is going to win you the game super quickly. If you only have a couple of attacks with this while it's saddled, it's going to take over the game on its own. On the other hand, it's a 5-drop. It doesn't do anything right away. It's got to survive a turn. And not only does it have to survive a turn, you also need at least 4 power of creatures to saddle it to actually get value out of it. If it's just a 5/5, it's not really playable at all. So it's going to be interesting to see how good this card is. Saddle 4, I don't think is a deal breaker. Like if you just curve out reasonably in a white deck, you should have 4 powers of creature to tap to this. Although there's going to be times when it's a problem. Like if your opponent rests your board, normally a card like this, like a Sun Titan effect, would be a great way to rebuild your board, but this is going to be kind of weak after a Wrath because you're not going to have anything to saddle it with. So if you're looking for comparisons for this card, it's kind of like Sun Titan, except your graveyard turns into your library, which I think is a more powerful ability if you can pull it off. I mean, Sun Titan's probably a better card overall because you don't have to jump through the hoops of waiting for it to lose summoning sickness because it has an ETB. You don't have to saddle it or anything. It's also kind of like a Zur the Enchanter, except you can get any permanent instead of just enchantments. So Guardian Sunmare. Is this card going to be standard playable? I want to say yes, because I love the design of this card. It's such a sweet design. So my heart tells me yes, but my head tells me it's probably just going to get bounced and killed. At least it has Ward 2, which does help. Like, it's going to be 4 mana to this town. It's going to be 4 mana to go for the throw day, which is helpful. At the same time, though, the card is so strong if you get to attack with it saddled. Your opponent's still going to spend the 4 mana to kill it if they get the chance, because they really just can't let you start tutoring out 3-drops, putting them into play for free. I really wish that this card had haste. If this had haste like Calamity, then I think this card would actually be really good. We've seen Calamity be a fairly effective card in some ramp decks where you just play it and saddle it, immediately get your value out of it. I kind of wish Guardian Sunmare was the same thing, or at least had like a lower saddle cost maybe. I'm worried that there's just too many hoops to jump through. You gotta give it haste probably, or hope that it survives somehow. The saddle cost is really high. So if it had the Calamity haste, I think this card would be kind of busted. I guess you can give it haste in Standard, and maybe that's one way to build around this, is use whatever, Lava Spur Boots, Bitter Reunion, Felonious Rage. But at the same time, even if you jump through the haste tube, you still need at least 4 other power on the battlefield, and then your reward is, I get a 3-drop, which is nice, but Calamity's reward is often like, I win the game on the spot by copying Terror of the Peaks or whatever, so it's not as high as a Calamity. I will say, I'm not super intimidated by Saddle 4. I kind of mentioned this before, assuming things go to plan. Like, if you're just playing the good white cards and curving out, you're probably going to have 4 power by the time you play this 5-drop. Doesn't mean it's going to survive necessarily, but I don't think the crew cost is super bad, unless you get Wrath or something, then it gets really bad. I think the best way to take advantage of this card, the card that kind of solves every problem with Guardian Sunmare, is Culloden Triumphcaster. So Culloden gives your mounts haste, and it automatically saddles them when they enter. So this does exactly what you want with Guardian Sunmare. If you have a Culloden out, you can play the Guardian Sunmare, it hastes in automatically, plus it's going to count as saddled. So when you attack with your hasty Guardian Sunmare, you just tutor out your best 3-drop or 2-drop or whatever, put it directly into play. So maybe there's something with Culloden and Guardian Sunmare. It's at least worth brewing for like an against the odds or something. Whether or not it's actually competitive, that's another question. We don't really have a great backup to Culloden, so there might be some consistency issues, but if you have Culloden and Guardian Sunmare, it's going to be very, very strong. In Commander, outside of being really good in Culloden decks, I would consider this in like Ishin decks that cares about attack triggers, horse decks obviously, like Thurid. I could see an argument maybe that you could just play it as a generically good white card like Sun Titan, although I feel like I don't even play Sun Titan that much anymore. Sun Titan used to be a staple that I would just play in like every white deck because I love the card and it's pretty powerful. But now it's kind of a card that I play once in a while. And I think that Sun Titan is just better than Guardian Sunmare since you don't have so many hoops to jump through. So if I'm not playing Sun Titan all the time, it's hard for me to imagine playing Guardian Sunmare all the time, because I think Sun Titan is mostly just doing the same thing, but more effective. And if Sun Titan's not making the cut, then Guardian Sunmare is probably not either. But I do think this card is really sweet. I feel like Guardian Sunmare It's one of those cards that has me excited to brew around it. I don't really expect it to be like a super competitive standard card. I feel like Wizards put enough safety valves on it with no haste and a high saddle cost that it's probably not going to be broken. But when you pull it off and when you do the thing with this card, it is going to be super sweet. We also got a new clone in Wax Steel Shaper. So 4 mana for a clone. When it enters as a copy of an artifact or creature that you control, but it has 2 upsides, flash and also cycling of 2. So this card kind of intrigues me. We've had flash clones in the past, a Stunt Double, Mocking Doppelganger, Shakashima's Protege. They all have different twists, upsides and downsides. The intriguing part of this card is I don't think we've had a flash clone in Standard maybe ever, or at least in a very long time if I miss something. Typically, they print these cards in like Commander precons, and they don't show up in Standard. I think the other big upside to this card, compared to a lot of other clones, is it's a Phyrexian Metamorph too. It can copy artifacts, so the ceiling on this card is super high. For 4 mana, you could be getting another Portal to Phyrexia. You could be getting another Atraxa. It's a bit of a drawback that it only hits your stuff, so if your opponent plays an Atraxa, you can't get a 4 mana version with your Wax Steel Shaper. But still, I mean, it's a pretty reasonably efficient card as far as clones go, and flash is a meaningful upside. I also like cycling on it for 2 reasons. First, it allows reanimation shenanigans. You can cycle it, reanimate it. It also just gives you a way to get rid of this card when it's not good. And that's one of the problems with clones, right? Clones are great when you already have something great on the battlefield, but if you have nothing good on the battlefield, then a clone doesn't really do anything because you don't have anything good to copy. So having cycling is actually a huge upside on a clone, because in the situations where it's going to be bad, well, you can turn it into another card for just 2 mana. I think the biggest issue I see for this card is it might just be bad 3 steps ahead. I feel like if you want to copy one of your own creatures at instant speed, 3 steps ahead does that while also being a counter and also being card filtering. Wax Steel Shaper, same amount of mana, but you just get the clone effect. I guess maybe you're slightly less likely to be blown out. 3 steps ahead, if your opponent kills a creature in response to you targeting it, it's going to fizzle. Wax Steel Shaper, if your opponent kills a creature with it on the stack, well, then you can always copy another creature artifact, assuming that you have one. Also kind of compares to like C Double, which doesn't really see play, although every time I've played C Double, I've been really impressed with it. So I think that 3 steps ahead might keep this from seeing competitive Standard play. In Commander, it's definitely good in a couple of places. Most obviously, it's another clone that works with Garuda. If you've ever seen a Garuda deck, the easiest way to play Garuda is just overload on 4 mana clones or even mana valued clones. 4 is the most common mana value, but even mana valued clones. So when you Garuda, hopefully you mill a clone that can copy Garuda, and then you Garuda again and mill another clone and copy Garuda. And you do this till you mill your entire deck and then Thassa's Oracle or whatever you want to do to win the game. So Wax Steel Shaper, just by being an even mana valued clone, going to be really good in Garuda decks. Also, I think it's good enough to see play in clone style decks, Shakashima of 1,000 Faces, Riku of 2 Reflections. Also, there's a couple of commanders like Hidetsugu and Carry that like clones specifically to legend rule away their commander, because Hidetsugu and Carry have a powerful death trigger. So if you Wax Steel Shaper it, it lets you sack 1 to get the trigger. So I think it could show up there as well. So Wax Steel Shaper, it's definitely a good clone. It is 4 mana, so it's not a cheap clone, but the combination of flash and cycling and being able to hit artifacts has me interested in this card. Whether it's actually better than 3 steps ahead in Standard, that might not be the case, but I still think this is close enough to keep in mind. If you want to copy something, this card is going to get the job done at a pretty reasonable rate. Next up, we get Monument of Endurance, which I think is one of the cooler build-arounds that we've seen from the set. So 3 mana artifact. It says whenever you discard a card, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Draw a card, create a treasure token, or each opponent loses 3 life. So obviously, this card is capped, so you can only use each ability once. Otherwise, this card would be insanely broken with things like wheels. But even with that downside, I still think this is one of the sweetest build-arounds that we've seen in a minute, because traditionally, there's not a lot of rewards for discarding your own cards. There's payoffs for making your opponents discard cards. But if you look back through Magic, there's like Bone Miser coming back as a special guest. I guess we get Cryptcaller's Chariot in Aetherdrift itself. But then you have, I guess, Drake Haven. There's some cards like Currency Converter that if you discard a card, let you exile it and eventually do something with it. But really, payoffs for self-discard isn't something that has really been heavily supported in Magic, because it turns out that discarding your own cards, super easy if you want to do it. So it actually has me very hyped to build around this card. If you think of the modes, none of them are game-breaking. They're all kind of one-mana effects. Whisper the Muse to draw a card, strike it rich, makes a treasure, bump in the night, hits an opponent for 3, I guess. Monument does hit each opponent, a little bit better in Commander, but close enough for a 1v1 format. So you're essentially getting a 1-mana spell effect each time you discard a card, but I think that that's enough, especially if you can build your deck to trigger this repeatedly. Also worth mentioning, it doesn't say whenever you discard one or more cards, which means if you have this out and you cast like Burning Inquiry, which is draw 3, discard 3 at random, you're going to trigger each of the modes because you discarded 3 cards. If you Wheel of Fortune, same thing, but remember, it is capped at 3. Once you use each mode, you can't use it again this turn. So if you Wheel of Fortune, you can't like make 7 treasures, which is where this card would be if it didn't have the once per turn cap, you could not print this card. Like, you just wouldn't be able to print it. It would be too busted in a whole bunch of different places. So as far as Standard is concerned, what do we do with Monument of Endurance? And I think there's a few different ways to go with this card. You get a bunch of blue looters, Rona and Kitsa and Jace, where you're just every turn you can tap them to draw and discard. The upside to these cards too is you can activate them at instant speed. And the most powerful thing you can do with Monument of Endurance is be discarding during your turn to max it out, and then discarding during your opponent's turn to max it out, to double up on the value you get out of it. So the looters are really nice. You could like tap Rona during your turn to draw a card, and then also loot with Rona, and then you tap Kitsa during your opponent's turn to do the same thing. We also have just a bunch of good red cards that happen to rummage when they enter, like Inti when you attack. You can discard a card and get value out of Fear Missing Out, Charming Scoundrel, Inti. So a deck with those cards could also take advantage of it. And I think that's kind of what you're looking for in Standard, is good cards that trigger this. They also are going to be fine doing other things in your deck. Also seems like a great payoff for the cycling deck. I think that's probably why they made this card, is a reward for cycling. Because when you cycle, you're discarding a card and drawing a card, and it's going to trigger the monument. And cycling works especially well with this because you can always cycle at instant speed. So it's a great way in a cycling deck that you can be triggering this again and again and again and getting a ton of value out of it. We'll have to see just how good cycling is in Standard. Last time cycling was heavily supported, we did have a real cycling deck in Standard, so I don't think it's impossible we have a cycling deck. If we do, I think Monument could definitely be one of the payoffs for it. I've also seen people mention playing this is like a sideboard hate card for discard. And I see where they're going with that. Like, your opponent Hopeless Nightmares, yeah, you gotta discard a card, but if you have Monument, then you get to draw another card, or make a treasure, or drain your opponent, or whatever. In reality, I don't think that plan's really going to be worth it. It's a nice upside. If you're playing a deck that's built around Monument of Endurance, you get the bonus that it's good against your opponent's discard, but I feel like playing this as like a sideboard hate card for discard, it's probably just going to be too slow. What I think actually is going to happen a lot of the time is your opponent places turn 1 discard, and you look at your hand and you're like, I guess I'm going to discard the Monument of Endurance because it's just going to be too long for me to get it on the battlefield. Once you get back to older formats, there is some weird combo potential. So even though Monument of Endurance only lets you pick each thing once each turn, the way the rules of Magic work is if you can blink something, it's a new version of itself, and then you can start choosing over again. So you can combo with this in a format like Pioneer Modern with Escape Protocol. So Escape Protocol, when you cycle a card, you can pay 1, and you can blink an artifact or creature you control, exile or return to the battlefield. So what you can do is cycle a card to draw a card. You can cycle a card to drain your opponent for 3. You can cycle a card to make a treasure token. Then, with that treasure token, you can pay the 1 to Escape Protocol to blink the Monument of Endurance when you cycled, reset it, start the process over. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of mana, right? Because you got to pay for cycling, unless you have like a new perspectives or something to reduce the cost on your cycling. So it is a lot of mana. So that's going to be the pinch on this from going fully infinite. But still, it does work really well because of the treasure token it makes. It kind of fuels itself. So as long as you can keep cycling, you can just keep blinking and triggering the Monument of Endurance all the way until you win the game. Also could be cute in like Hollow One. I'm not saying that tier competitive Modern Hollow One is going to play Monument of Endurance. In reality, it's too slow, I think, for a format like Modern. Yeah, it's cool that you can play Monument and then Burning Inquiry and get a bunch of value out of it, but Modern's just so fast, you're going to be dead to Guide of Souls or staring down some massive Eldrazi by the time you're like, make a treasure, draw a card, drain you for 3. So it probably won't work in practice, but I'm excited to build around and try it, because it does seem like a shell like Hollow One should be really good at maxing this out every single turn. As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card's good with any commander that's going to be drawing and discarding cards. Sidar, Jabari, Rafine, Riel, but it's going to be at its best with commanders that can repeatedly draw and discard, like Anj Falconwrath, Mary Reed, and Anne Bounty. These cards are ridiculous with Monument because you tap them and then they untap themselves when you discard the right thing. You max out the Monument, then you just pass and do it again during your opponent's turn, then your next opponent's turn. So in those decks where your commander can repeatedly loot or rummage, this is going to be one of the best payoffs in your deck. I also think it's probably just good in wheel decks. Wheel decks are kind of weird because a lot of time you're discarding and drawing is going to come in one shot at sorcery speed during your turn. But still, if this is giving you a card, a treasure, and 3 life loss for each opponent every turn, that's probably still worth it, right? That seems worth it enough. I play Phyrexian Arena just to draw an extra card each turn. If this is at least drawing me an extra card each turn cycle, I've already built myself a Phyrexian Arena, and all the other stuff is a bonus. So Monument of Endurance, I love this card. I love seeing self-discard is something that you can build around, something that's being rewarded. It's relatively new to Magic, so it's also very just impressive that they're still kind of coming up with new things to do with Magic cards 30 years into the game. So Monument of Endurance, I don't think this card's gonna like break anything, but I do think it's a super cool design that we are definitely gonna be building around. We also got another absurd green power creepy creature in Webstrike Elite. So double green for a 3/3 insect archer with reach, and then it has cycling of double green and X, and when you cycle this card, disrupt to 1 target artifact or an enchantment with mana value of X. So Webstrike Elite, this is another card that it's just pretty power creepy, right? There's only a handful of 2-mana 3/3s in all of Magic. They don't have any downside. Keen-Eyed Curator, Werewolf Pack Leader, and these cards always tend to be really good. Werewolf Pack Leader was great during its run in Standard. Keen-Eyed Curator, I see in this Standard, even though green's not very good. And this is on par with these cards, and in some ways, even better. Like, you get Reach as a bonus, and in our current Standard, blowing up artifacts and enchantments actually incredibly powerful. You get this, like, I guess, more expensive Molder built into it, although since it's a cycling ability, it's essentially uncounterable, which is a nice little bonus. So Webstrike Elite, as I mentioned before, because we're in a Standard where artifacts and enchantments are so powerful, Caretaker's Tale, Unholy Annex, Urbra's Forge, plus we're getting all these new artifacts in Aetherdrift itself, I feel like that cycling mode really makes this card. This is an on-curve or really above-the-curve 2-drop that also works like a spell in the late game. Yeah, it's going to be expensive if you want to blow up a Caretaker's Tale. You're going to have to spend 5 mana, same with Urbra's Forge, so it's not cheap, but still you get a card out of it, and it deals with one of your opponent's best threats. Green in this Standard is kind of insanely good at blowing up artifacts. I think that's actually a mark against this card, is there's so many other ways you can blow up artifacts. On the other hand, you can definitely build a green deck that just absolutely really destroys artifact decks. We actually played mono green control not that long ago, and that was part of the theory of it. But between this card and Insidious Fungus and Haywire Mite and District Mascot and Tranquil Philbrack and Scrap Shooter, and even finishers like Vivian Reed and Nissa, almost every good green card, it seems like, just blows up an artifact or an enchantment. So it's going to be interesting to see. Maybe there can be like this weird green anti-meta deck where you're playing these above-the-curve creatures that also are just blowing up your opponent's best artifacts and enchantments. I think this card, to me, reminds me of Angorasaur Rex. So Angorasaur Rex, when this was spoiled a few days ago, I said it was a card that was an obvious example of power creep, but I thought still might be unplayable in Standard, and I feel the same way about Webstrike Elite. This is going to be the test of green in Standard. If green is still not good enough, with Angorasaur Rex, with Webstrike Elite, with these power creepy creatures that have so much upside and you can cycle them, then I'm just going to assume that green is dead. Like, then the problem really is that Sunfall and this down ain't big enough and Go for the Throw and Cut Down and all the removal in Standard is just too much for green to handle. Like, if these power creepy green threats are not enough to keep up with the format, then I think green is just a bad color, and it's probably going to be a bad color for a while. So we'll have to wait and see, but I think that Webstrike Elite could be the card, along with Angorasaur Rex and the other power creepy green cards in Standard, that maybe, just maybe, could bring back some sort of mono green stompy deck in Standard. In the world of lower rarity cards, we got our blue vanilla legend, and it is a super big butted octopus in Corlona Coral Tyrant. So a 2-mana 0/8 octopus, and this card is interesting. Speaking of power creep, not that this is bad power creep or anything like that, but this is the first 2-mana 0/8 that we've ever seen in Magic. Actually, if you look at 0/8s in Magic, I could only find 3. Erratic Cyclops, which is a 4-drop, and then 2 Walls. So this just being a 2-mana with 8 toughness, that by itself is notable. Actually, if you look at 2-drops in Magic, the highest toughness 2-drops that I could find, discounting like Hunted Horror and stuff that has just ridiculous downsides, they don't play like normal creatures, were Giant Ox and Dragoneye Savants. So this is actually +2 toughness, plus 25% toughness compared to the past highest toughness 2-drop we've ever seen. So does this actually matter? Does having a 0/8 for 2 mana actually do anything? And the answer is not really, but in Sweet against the odds decks, yes. So in Standard, we have a couple of cards that let you deal damage equal to toughness rather than your power. Like if you have a Bedrock Tortoise or can back up a Streetwise Negotiator, then this is a 2-mana 8/8 essentially instead of a 2-mana 0/8. And a 2-mana 8/8, that is a very ridiculous Magic card. We also have Pride of the Whole Clad, which just cares about a lot of toughness on the battlefield. This is going to be one of the best ways to get down Pride if you want to in Standard. As far as Commander is concerned, it's mostly a butts card. If you're playing a commander that specifically cares about high toughness, like Chariot or Plagon or Phoenix or Geralf, then I think this card probably in the conversation just because it is the highest toughness card of its mana value that we've ever seen in Magic. Although sadly, it doesn't work in Arcades. And Arcades is like the most popular butts commander just because it's not a defender. So you don't draw a card with it. It doesn't work with the Arcades static ability. So it doesn't really fit there. But I think that this card, it's pretty sweet. I was thinking that the blue vanilla would be a super high toughness creature. I was thinking it was going to be a 4-drop, so I'm kind of surprised it's a 2-drop. But this card, it's super cool, it's very unique, and could have relevance in some sort of butts deck. Of course, we also got some lower rarity draft stuff that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Aetherdrift spoilers for today. So how are you feeling about this? I think we have one more day of spoiler season. Tomorrow's the last day, and we should have the full set. So make sure to come back tomorrow for one more look at Aetherdrift. Until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? We can find our last spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Much Brew where we played 20 hair appearance in Standard.